A common programming error made by novice programmers when they program with arrays is to use a reference element in an array of references without initializing it to an object. What does this mean? To illustrate or to discuss this, let's consider an example. Assume you are asked to create 4 invoices at the end of business. Assume your boss says that the invoices, you need to submit a report based on the invoices generated on the day, and assume you had generated 4 invoices, so you're required to produce a report. So you go about designing an invoice and assume the invoice has got description of the product and a cost of the product. So you have an invoice in which you know the data items or information is the description and the cost, and also assume you want to be able to set the value of the description, so you may need a function set description, and you may also need a function to set the cost. Similarly, you may need to get the cost and get the description, so you need a function to get the cost and get description to return the description. So to do this, you probably would have private string description and we would have private float cost. The reason why we want them private is because we want to hide instance variables. We want to hide them from other classes, so other classes should not be able to access these instance variables because they are vulnerable to change by external classes. So we prevent that by making them private. However, we make the methods public, so these methods would be public set, so each one of them would be public. All these would be public methods. So I don't have to do that again, but that's how we do. So by making them public, we enable other classes to be able to use these private instance variables indirectly through the public methods. So that's Java's way of protecting the variables from inadvertent changes from external classes. The second point is this models one invoice, but since we want many invoices, we have to have an array of invoices. How do we do that? Let's look at this next. So we want many invoices. In our case, since we have created 4 invoices and we want to generate one report for the 4 invoices, we could write this as invoice. So you could say my invoices. This is what so this declares that my invoices is a reference to an array, but my invoices is not an array as yet. So it's not an array. It's not yet an array. Not yet an array. It's just an array reference. However, when you want to create the invoices array, you would write my invoices is equal to new invoice, and then because you have created 4 invoices, you have to create an array of 4. This is the tray that can occupy 4 invoices. Remember, no invoices themselves have been created, but a tray to point to 4 invoices is created. So the name of the tray is my invoices. The tray has got 4 references, and each of these references is a reference to an invoice. But at the moment when this gets executed, each of those references will be automatically set to null. That means they are not pointing to any objects, all set to null. Once the array is created, a natural tendency would be to write something like my invoices bracket 0 dot set description to describe the first invoice, and suppose it's about a flask. Suppose the description is about a flask, so you would write set description flask, and then suppose the cost of the flask was say $10. You would write bracket set cost, you would write 10.0f because this is a float. Now this would set values of first to an object that's referenced by index 0. Now similarly you would continue doing this for invoice 1, invoice both the cost and the description for invoice 1, invoice 2, invoice 3, and so these would be for the 4 invoices. Remember, we have 4 invoices to be set, so you would do this 4 times. So our plan would be to first set the details of each invoice. So the details of each invoice are, one is the description, so you set the description and the cost. So you would use the set description method and the set cost method of each invoice, and we do that using something like my invoice bracket 0 dot set description or my invoice bracket 0 dot set cost. So you will do this for each of them, and we replace this 0 by 1 by 2, etc. So the second point is, once we set it, the second point is to generate a report. Generate a report simply do something very similar to this, but this time rather than setting, we get the values. So you would write something like my invoice bracket 0 description, and then because this returns a string, we could store it in a variable. So you could say report. To this report we can also add that same report, we can also add my invoice 0 dot get cost. So once you get it, so you get now the value of the report description and the value of the cost, and all that will be assigned to a variable called report. Suppose first invoice had a value flask, and suppose the cost was was $10. So report would then be, the value of report would then be equal to flask by 10. If we repeat this to the next item, suppose we write report is equal to report plus, suppose we write report is equal to report plus, same thing for the next item, and continue doing this, and at the end report will contain the values or the descriptions and the cost of all the 4 items. So the last thing would simply be to simply print them out, system.out.println, and if you print the report, that's what you get. So the Java equivalent of this would be to have description and a cost as the instance variable, and this time we make them private because we want to hide them, and normally we put them on 2 separate lines, but due to economy of space, I've written that on the same line. Similarly, our set description, normally it would be written on separate lines, but I've written the code, the method in the same line just to save the space, so that I can view the whole program in one screen. We need set cost, and remember D is here, C is a parameter, and this value in your parameter would be assigned to the instance variable cost. Description similarly is a method, a public method, which returns a string, and the value of the string is nothing but the value in description, and the data type of the return value is string. That's why this is string and not void. Similarly, the data type of get cost, the return value of the data type of get cost is float. This is what we would do. This is the definition of the invoice. It represents the model for one invoice. So that is a representation of a model for one invoice. So we want more than one invoice, so we create an array of invoices. So we write new invoice bracket 4 because we have created only 4 invoices in our day to day. So probably the next thing we would intuitively do would be something like this: invoice.set description So this, suppose the name of the first description of the first item is flash disk. This is what you write. If you want to set the cost, you would set it. So you would do this for the second item, the third item, and the fourth item. So the last part, of course, would be you would write a variable such as this. You would have a heading for the report which says today's invoices, and then you get the description as we have discussed earlier, and then we finally print the report, which is the value stored in the variable report. Remember, this is a local variable, and the local variable has the cumulative values of the description and the cost for each of these items, and then we display it. When we run this, surprised to see that does not produce the desired output. This is what we get. We have an runtime error. So such an error is very difficult to identify because the compiler hasn't identified. It's only at runtime it raises an error. So let's get into this. So go into line 12, and it says there is a null pointer exception, which basically indicates that invoices is being invoked on an object that's not created. If you see here, this statement number 10 has only created a tray of references, but where are the objects? The tray is empty. Each one of them is referring to null. We want to use an object, an invoice, we have to first create them. The objects need to be created, and then only in that we can set the values for flash disk, etc. So this is not created, this one's not created, this one's not created, this one's not created. So these statement number 12, 13, 14 and 15 are actually not valid because they assume that these are created. So these are not created, so our responsibility would be to go in and create the objects. Would go in and create the objects. So I could say invoices bracket 0 is equal to new invoice. It is not invoices views, so that is invoices bracket 0, and this should be bracket 1. Otherwise we do it for the other two as well. So we have, this is to be fixed, that this is going to be 3, 2, and this one's invoices, and this one's invoices 2, and it should be the variable name is invoices, So now, and we compile and run this time, compile the Java virtual machine uses the right output, and we see that the output is right. So to summarize, we see we must not use array of references without instantiating each reference variable of the array of reference. So this is very important, and this is a common programming error that needs to be avoided. That's frequently done by novice programmers, and that needs to be absolutely avoided.